All right, so I'd like to go ahead and, first of all, thank you everybody for coming here. This faculty workshop or faculty colloquium is being organized in conjunction with Kate Shapson as the Director of Faculty Research and Development, and I'm pleased to host and introduce Dr. John Haskell. John Haskell, who you met, is a longtime friend and collaborator. He is a graduate of the University of California, Hastings, hold a PhD from the University of London, where he worked under the supervision of Matt Craven and Scott Newton, writing on the history of international law. And I'm really thrilled to host him for a number of reasons. One of them is that John joins us from Mississippi College School of Law, and we're hoping to build more long-standing relationships with that institution. And so I'm delighted to have you in a professional capacity, in a personal capacity. Thank you for your friendship, and I look forward to your thoughts. The title of the paper is An Anti-Biography of Francis Liebert, Words of Structuralist Jurisprudence. It's a very teasing title, a very interesting title, and I look forward to everybody's thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks for being so gracious. Hi. So I'm extremely self-conscious that I feel very Wizard of Ozzy standing behind this. Especially because the topic seems a little bit eclectic in that it's about the turn to history over the last 10 to 15 years in international law, which has been going on first in Europe, and we're seeing its sort of waves coming over to the United States. Let me just say thanks first to the University of Memphis School of Law. Every time I come here, I'm just re-fascinated by this building.
Yeah.
It's the most beautiful law school I've ever seen. I think that Boris and I both have spent time at Harvard, and I studied there as a visiting researcher under the Institute for Global Law and Policy, which is funding this paper, actually, this research, through Professor David Kennedy. Very grateful for that. And even those facilities, which are absolutely stunning, this is giving it a run for the money.
Right.
Yeah, it's absolutely gorgeous. So thank you, Boris, and also to Kate Shapson. Okay, so there's that idea that we hear sometimes floating around that you can be done with the past, but the past isn't done with you. And I want to think about that in two senses today. The first, so on the one hand, the title is An Anti-Biography of Francis Liebert. Well, who was Liebert? Francis Liebert was considered one of the fathers of social sciences. He wrote probably the first American textbook on political science. He maybe coined words like criminology. He liked to say that he coined many words, but it's, there's a little bit of suspicion. He thought he had a chin that looked like Caesar, so he's that sort of individual who says things like that. But he's a fascinating character because he's also one of the fathers of international law. And he grew up in there's a debate when he was born, 1798, 1800, and he grew up in a Prussian family that was very militaristic, as was common at the time. His older brothers had fought against Napoleon, and he ends up fighting against Napoleon in his teens, having committed himself to setting up a secret society to assassinate Napoleon. And he gets shot in the neck. He survives somehow, gets dragged into a farmhouse where he recovers without medication, gets to a hospital, ends up fighting in the Greek War of Independence, is put under house arrest in Prussia, where he writes a lot of poetry and thinks he's going to become a famous poet. He sends his poetry out to people he likes. He never gets comments back. He's disheartened. Years later, he finds out they liked his poetry. He tells his wife, at least. And he ends up in London studying under the famous historian Niebuhr. And that's where he says he learned how to be safe. So some of the excesses that had led him to want to be part of an assassination plot and fight in these wars are mitigated. And he gets to know the Benthams, the Austins. He helps set up the University of London system. He meets his wife. He comes over to America in his 20s, writing poetry about it in the Garden of Eden, the New World. And he sets up the second gymnasium in America. John Adams is swimming there. He gets to know John Adams. He writes one of the first 2 or 3 encyclopedias where he gets to know Joseph Story and Chancellor Kent. Good friends, they have volumes of letters back and forth. And through a series of events, he ends up teaching law down in the South. And then spends the last 15 years or so up north. And during that time of that transition, really what marks that break is the Civil War. And he's probably most famously remembered for drafting the General Orders Number 100, right, the first modern code of war that's still talked about at West Point and things like that, the Lieber Code. He had 3 sons that fought in the Civil War. One son, Oscar, in the South, who ends up dying. And he feels a lot of guilt about that because he had always been pushing Oscar to be this militaristic type character and sent him out to Germany in the 1840s. And his other 2 sons fight in the north. One of them gets badly wounded but survives. And he was one of the head legal advisors to Lincoln. He worked very closely with Halleck, who was one of the generals. So he has this, he's just an enigmatic figure. He knows everybody. He founds a lot of disciplines almost. And for our purposes, he's there at the initial stages where international law becomes professionalized, where it becomes an academic discipline where you can get a paycheck, where there's students in the classroom, and we start seeing journals, monographs, institutes, and all that sort of stuff being set up. In fact, he is considered the father of the Institut de Droit International, which was the first really significant international, in the modern sense, international law group, right? So they published a journal, they gave advisory opinions, and he was also the one behind arguing that they should try to codify international law, without arguing for, with no sort of ambition of having a global rule of law that all states would follow. So it looked very similar to the sensibility you would see today in international law. Excuse me, I was told. Okay. So there's that kind of stuff that happens, just to give a sense of who this Lieber character is, but the title of this paper is an anti-biography of Francis Lieber. And what I want to do is think about that idea that the past isn't done with you in another sense. The sense that we constantly, almost like a fetish, come back to the past. We're constantly speaking about it. It's in the beginning of our textbooks, it's in journals. We reference it to understand ourselves. And so what I would like to do today, using the character, or the place mark of Lieber, I would like to use Lieber as a way of thinking about how the profession thinks about its sort of history, and the different models that we take when we're carrying out this sort of memory in the literary production of international law. And I think that what I would like to do is talk about 3 different models of how we remember the past. Think about what that tells us about how we conceive of ourselves now, and then propose one problem maybe that collapses the differences between these models and shows where there might be a big blind spot. And the argument I'm going to make, the thesis I'd like to put forward, is that in all the various models that we see, no matter how sophisticated towards historical analysis, they all ultimately both juxtapose themselves against what they see as a metaphysical or essentialist reading of history, but they reproduce that same essentializing sort of feature and how it functions rhetorically in the text. So 3 models, look at one theme that's a blind spot, and then sort of conclude with some ideas about what we could possibly do differently if we were going to do historical analysis in international law. Boris asked me to situate this very quickly in my own research, and basically what I'm doing is I'm writing a book on the Protestant influence on the development of American approaches to international law and governance, and thinking specifically on the idea of modern international law. So I tell that story from the 19th century, and I'm writing a series of articles on these little side issues that keep popping up that are problematic, and this is one of about 10 papers. I'm about 4 or 5 in right now that I'm writing around these topics, and we'll end up there. Okay, so there's 3 models. So let's jump into it. The first model we could call the supersized approach, right? And I apologize, I'm probably going to be doing that thing where I read and look up, because this is actually a draft paper that's about 25 pages in, 20 pages. But it's very much a work in progress. So I appreciate that. Any comments and thoughts? This is the first time getting to talk to somebody, right? Other than trying to speak to my dad about it, he just sort of glazes over. Right? But I'm sure that's more in my presentation, so I'll try not to have that happen. But I appreciate you hearing me. Okay, so the first approach is the supersize approach. And here we would generally link it with the traditional 20th century way of doing history. This is William Greve, the Epochs of International Law, or epochs, however you want to say it. This is Carl Schmitt, the Nomos of the Earth. This would be Nussbaum's, a concise history of the law of nations. And usually they're tomes, either tomes that talk about great states and key ideas, how they develop over time in the work of jurists, or alternatively, how different states or a set of great powers have interpreted these doctrines, and what's the relationship between those great ideas and how they develop, and these great states and how they play out. So Greve, for example, would talk about the Dutch period, the Spanish period, the French era, the British era, and now the American era of the post-American century. And in this, we see that epochs are defined by a common spirit, which is led by a principal state or set of powers, each that have their own personality of governance, and that can be witnessed through their diplomatic relations, warfare, and the juridical writings of key authors. And this all seems to take place in a territorially organized system in the post-Westphalian order. So what emerges out of this sort of historical research is a question of how do you achieve order in an anarchistic world of self-interested nation-states? And what's the role of international law in that? We even see that as sort of like a preface question oftentimes in textbooks that comes up on international law. And if you look for Lieber, you don't really see him in the traditional work. He fell off the radar. But if you did see Lieber in the future, because there's sort of been a resurfacing of this figure in the market, you would imagine that they would identify his work with some key doctrinal concept, which is then claimed to characterize that era of law, and then to trace out how these doctrines were postulated in his work, probably drawing upon a few select quotes from one of the main texts. And I'm trying to think of an example. So an example would be, we see that he codified the laws of war. This denotes a preoccupation with codification in international law. The fact that he doesn't think that states are bound to it, but it's just persuasive possibly, shows that he was part of the positivist jurisprudence, and we would look about how these doctrines of national self-determination and such played into the positivist era. What would be missed here, obviously, is the 48 boxes of archives at the Huntington Library, his secondary writings, his institutional practice, his activism as an Episcopalian, his work within the State Department, his work on claims courts and so forth, and how that impacted these doctrines. So that would be the supersized approach. We're thinking great states in big terms, and politically it could go either way. You could be anti-imperialist, anti-American century, post-colonial literary theory, or you could tell an intellectual history that was posturing itself as something more sensible and reasonable and analyzing terms and taking a more neutral step-back approach. Or you could be relatively conservative and argue, like Carl Schmitt, the fascist, and argue that we're seeing the breakdown of the Western order with the universalization of international law, and this is a problem, and this history tells that problem of a lost period of glory. So, supersize. The second model we could call the false consciousness approach to international law. And this is a little bit more developed and popular right now in the turn of history. And basically you find this among critical international scholars. So in Boston, Helsinki, London, Toronto, and they're usually associated with certain schools of thought. For example, third world approaches to international law, new approaches to international law. And they meet at conferences around thematic sort of questions. What are the blind spots in the history of international law? Or reading political economy into something, etc. And here I think there's two variants that complement each other that we see within this model. In the first model, what they identify, so they posture themselves against the mainstream history, the supersize approach. And they say that this history creates what David Kennedy calls the history of an illusion, to the extent that the contemporary legal memory misreads the work of its predecessors by inscribing past arguments and doctrines with their own contemporaneous legal prejudices or agendas, whether they know that or not. And so in relation to Lieber, the false consciousness model would demonstrate that Lieber's polemic for the nation state, for example, was not an expression of any positivist jurisprudence, that there was no such thing as positivism back then, but rather a more sophisticated argument usually identified with the post-World War I era of the idea that law is grounded or embedded in social practice, in some sense. So they would go back and they would analyze the text, but put them in relation to other writers' texts. They would seek to understand that literature within the socio-political framework to sort of add richness to the actual language itself, to understand better what the legal arguments were. And they'd be seeking to dethrone that idea that it's just happening at the great state model, or that these ideas are readily transferable across time through interpretation. So the false consciousness here is that it's rooted in the current treatment of past legal eras, which claims to describe things as they were, but in fact routinizes historical materials to modern narrative agendas and professional sensibilities, willingly or unwillingly. Now, there's another way that they go about telling this history in the false consciousness approach. And in the second variation of this model, they challenge the mainstream claim that the fundamental dynamic within international legal theory is the struggle of order between formally equal but self-interested nation states. And what they argue is that behind the assumption as to the progressive nature of international legal history, there's actually this silent struggle of oscillating initiations of domination that are not only manifest in the structure of international law, but in the very doctrines that are oftentimes held out as emancipatory. So let's use an example to try to explain how that process works. One of the founders of third world approaches to international law, and he's very popular in history right now, is Anthony Angie. And Professor Angie says that the international legal theory that we see today did not originate in questions of state mediation, but the dynamic of cultural difference that played out in the colonial experience and which continues in various manifestations today. And he thinks about what are the social political effects of that. So the transition from speaking about Christendom to civilization and applying its standards to global populations and the works of people like Francis Lieber for Angie do not mark an early moment of breaking European hegemony or Eurocentricity towards some sort of universalization, but rather should be seen as a way that European populations solidified their cultural hegemony over a conceptual vocabulary of governance, and by extension mechanized rulership in political life through a seemingly neutral regime of international legal norms. And you could do this sort of argument in a number of ways if you were going to do history. You could trace out the racist undertones of his construction of civilization and culture. You could draw out particularly scandalous quotes where he calls for the genocide of non-Caucasian people. You might look at how these doctrines were actually carried out in institutionalized practice in the colonial era, and so forth and so on. So what you would do is you would say there's a story of talking about Lieber, which is national self-determination, you know, the rise of liberal democracy, international law as a gatekeeper to political agendas, mainstream approach. And the false consciousness approach steps in and says, first of all, it wasn't great states and these legal doctrines the way you're talking about. And secondly, it's not nearly as progressive as you think. Behind this story is these dark sides to our virtue. In the false consciousness model, in other words, the practice of historical study in academic legal literature is a deeply political act with the goal of unearthing through discourse analysis and empirical study how seemingly neutral regimes of law mechanize political inequality between cultures, right? So we move from the idea of talking about states to thinking about how cultures interact and struggle with each other. Okay, so that's the second approach. There's a third model that we see in history, and we could call this the Subjectivist Model. And the Subjectivist Model emphasizes the importance of archival research in historical scholarship and seeks to embed these writings from the past in a variety of institutional traditions engaged in the construction of meaning and governance. Probably the most famous historian in this model that really kicked this off was Martti Kostaniemi at the University of Helsinki with his book, The Gentle Civilizer of the Nations. Though it's becoming a big deal. So next month going to the European Society of International Law to speak on this strange dude, Francis Lieber. And this is coming out of this sort of work of the last 10 years where you wouldn't have seen this before. And when you go to the tables at lunch, each one will be named by a pastorist. Well, where did that come from, this sort of sensibility? And it really kicked off about 10 years ago with the publication of this book, The Gentle Civilizer of Nations. And this sort of scholarship in the subjectivist model, on the one hand, it's sympathetic with the previous two frameworks in that, like the supersized model, we're also interested in tracing out the intellectual development of doctrines in the work of famous pasturists, and thinking about how they might play into national traditions and so forth. And like the false consciousness model, it's attuned to excavating how contemporary memory of disciplinary thought distorts the actual logic and feelings that inform legal doctrines of the past. And it can even be sympathetic with post-colonial revisionist histories. But on the other hand, it also breaks on a number of fronts. So against the supersized approach, the nation-state is now just one of many institutional frameworks for tracing out the development of international legal thought. And just as important now to these doctrines are looking at how they were shaped by newly minted academic departments through the new professional role offered to legal experts in international legal theory, through the proliferation of innovative publication mediums like the monograph, the textbook, etc., and so on. So the national traditions and so forth would still be important, but now they compete in some sort of uneasy give and take with an almost endless array of institutional apparatuses to affect the production of international legal life. So that's how it would juxtapose itself against the subjectivist model, against the supersized model. But it would also go against the false consciousness model. And it's no longer simply concerned with analyzing legal doctrines in their relationship to wider literary traditions that they operated within discourse analysis, nor is it just interested in replacing the traditional emphasis of the state with something like culture or dispossessed populations or society, those sort of moves. Rather, the goal now is to embed these texts and their institutional and intellectual contexts in the subjective anxieties and passions of the individual lives of the authors themselves. To return to Francis Lieber, it will not be enough to analyze his text carefully, to place it in relation to his peers, to show the political content of his theories and practice. Instead, we need to connect his particular writings to where he lived in his life. What he was doing in his professional role when he wrote that. Or what he was saying in his private communications when he wrote this. And this means not only reading his texts and compiling more discrete archival facts, it means pinpointing what organizations he worked within, who he was speaking to, where he lived, and what sort of extracurricular activities he participated in, and even more broadly, the dynamics of the wider social political events at the time, and how they both impacted him and how he responded to them. So we're getting to an idea of a very individualized unit. If we move from the state, we go to culture, now we're talking about the individual subjectivity, and there's a corresponding shift, just like with the subject, with the sort of materials, and the way you're going to try to look at causation. Okay, so those are the three models. So we got three models up on the board towards Francis Lieber and how that might take place. What I'd like to do is set those models on the side and analyze them now through a thesis. My thesis comes from Louis Althusser, and he wrote this book called Politics and History. And Althusser is a strange figure. He murdered his wife. He was self-committed to an insane asylum, a mental institution. But back then, if you think about what it was, how they treated patients, went through electroshock therapy.
What years was this about?
Althusser was writing from the 50s to the 80s. And he was a very influential figure in France in the 60s and early 70s. He sort of came on the back of Lacan and Saussure and people like that. He was part of the Communist Party, but he was a vicious critic of the Communist Party, arguing for some sort of pure Marxism, but basically ended up being ostracized by everyone, right? And while his politics have largely fallen by the wayside, some of his insights into how we think about history or how we analyze the structure are possibly interesting. And I want to steal from him kind of one of his ideas and put it on the table for how we might be able to play with that in a sort of depoliticized sense. So the thesis is that history is a process without a subject. So up to this stage, the analysis has highlighted distinctions between these models, especially in terms of the source material and the thematic objects of study. For example, if the turn to history seeks to reveal the dynamics that drive international law, we see 3 different answers rooted in 3 different subjects. In the supersized model, the subjects are sovereign apparatuses, usually called nation-states, which exercise their authority upon and through legal doctrine, the resulting dynamic being how to foster order between relatively autonomous, self-interested actors. In the false consciousness model, the subjects are traditionally silenced groups or cultures of people, usually marginalized on the basis of their gender, race, poverty, and so forth. And the motor of international legal history is how this procedure of creating difference and marginalization has morphed over the centuries, especially in the phenomenon of colonialism. And then in the subjectivist approach, the importance of states, cultures, and so forth is not given up, but their importance is at least partially displaced to the extent that international law is now seen as a profession, comprised and originating in myriads of individualities, of these individual authors, who both operate on and are influenced by these broader institutional and ideological forces in the creation of the doctrines. So there's a progress story lurking here. We sort of move from a hierarchical quasi-metaphysics of great powers and eminent legal doctrines to an awareness of its own historical embeddedness, being the production of cultures and places, which is not abandoned, but ultimately transitions to an almost anthropological practice of centering history on the subjectivity of individual actors in institutional settings. So we want to become very empirical. We want to be, and we also want to start becoming more contingent in understanding how this develops. And the transition we see is from the sky to the ground, from the state to the individual, from essentialist to situationally contingent understandings of international law, which in turn seems to contain some sort of counseling towards a sensibility of political liberalism, tolerance to differences, and so forth. And that seems, in our current moment, at least intuitively correct. That makes sense. But there's also, in addition to those differences in the text, there's also a number of similarities that they share. And this is where I think it starts being problematic. So far in each model, a subject is proposed that makes the history of international law. States, cultures, and individuals. In other words, the history of international law is the result of actions performed by a subject, the difference being that in each model, the determination of that subject changes, and all of them rely on a critique of the previous model being too idealist. So The supersized model on the real politic of states criticizes the more natural law jurisprudence and those sort of feelings. The false consciousness model adopts culture as a correction to the abstraction of states. And the subjectivist model builds on this former approach, but argues that we have to clarify culture is not something that simply exists geographically, but within institutional practices, and looks at the real human, the individual, and so forth, where the infinite diversity of needs and desires and so on are condensed into the unity of a personality, which then, as a personality, makes history even as it's acted upon and forced to respond. What's missing here is that it's one thing to say, well, this unity of states or cultures or individuals, this unity of personality, it's one thing to say, well, it's remarkably adaptable. It's continuously influenced by its internal relations and outside forces. That's usually what happens. Yes, there's an idea of culture, but we recognize there's not an idea of culture. It's actually very diverse. And even when we look at culture, we see it's a messy thing with lots of internal dynamics, and there's a lot of bleed over. There's no heuristically sealed idea of culture. It's always changing. That's the typical way we think about it today. But the form itself, the legal form of culture, is not questioned as an appointment of the measure or unit of history's motor. Whatever subject, in other words, that ultimately gets chosen to tell our history, somehow always seems to come to us prior to the struggle that it is then said to be subject to. Right? So, for instance, let's think about how Angie talks about culture. Cultures are indeed simultaneously part of the rhetorical toolkit of imperialism and the objects that imperialism works for and upon, but even if you adopt that sort of critical reading, he still posits that these cultures pre-exist the colonial encounter in their formal description as cultural systems. So the substance changes. Yes, cultures are always adapting and have different habits and routines, but the legal form itself, or the ideational form itself of culture, when we look out and we see people and we think, oh, it's a culture, we don't historicize that form itself or think about how that form was produced, that set of identification marks. The problem with the history of international law and the colonial experience, right, for Angie, is that its legal doctrines have been aligned with European ideas of social order, political organization, and so forth, that preserve a distinct culture and end up alienating rather than empowering the subjectivity and personality of peoples. The problem for Angie is not the legal form of culture itself, but how cultures use the conceptual vocabulary of international law to enforce and maintain relations of domination and inequality. We could think of the counterpoint to that, how a culture does good things, right, etc. The point here is not, and here's Angie's quote, the point here is not to condemn the ideas of international law as being inherently imperial constructs, but rather to question how it is that these ideals have become used as a means of furthering the project of imperialism, and why it is that international law and institutions seem so often to fail to make these ideas a reality, and he calls on people instead to be empowered to make history rather than simply replicate it and so forth, as we do at the end of monographs. So this is a project of revisionist historicism, to write marginalized voices back into the grand narratives and so forth, relying on this idea of the culture, right, of a people. What is lost here is exactly the opportunity to denaturalize the legal form itself, and to be able to then ask, well, how is it that this very form, right, of this apparatus, for example, culture or the individual, of these elementary drives, how were they themselves generated as a form to identify things with? According to what logic and through what social processes are agents made into subjects? And how is this process reproduced in and through specific social formations concerning the relations between groups of people and things, in other words, distribution, production, etc. In short, how do we come to recognize a group of people as a culture or a person as an individual in the first place, and simultaneously what conceptual factors are backgrounded when we adopt this legal form as the description. So Anke might rightly note that the mainstream dismissal of how European cultures developed was actually a give and take, and that this creates a mythic state of nature of an idea of Europe as just sort of happening. But the same could be said with the legal forms themselves, are not actually concrete expressions of things happening on the ground, but rather a new claim to authenticity, which is an abstraction. It's dehistoricized. And so what would we do different? So a historical orientation that refuses the temptation of identifying an us that makes history, and without thinking of the us, instead of doing that, or an us that makes history, we could instead think about the us as an appendice or a bearer of a historic, like a bearer, like
bearer.
yeah, like I wouldn't say a reflection necessarily because it works back and forth, but as maybe a symptom.
Okay.
A symptom of a historically situated condition and logic of production that would make us think about Lieber differently if we looked at him and how we'd study him. So the international legal historian would no longer follow Lieber just as a place mark, as in the superside approach for talking about legal doctrines or about what states were doing. And in that sense, the subjectivist and false consciousness approach is really important in that they say embed this history and break beyond this sort of grand narrative. But on the other hand, it would go against the false consciousness and subjectivist models in that it would argue they do not offer a more concrete analysis, because for all of their theorization to inverse the ideology of traditional studies from the state to some more anthropological object, they ultimately fail to extend this de-essentialist critique far enough to think about through its, to sort of, how would I say it? So you could say it like to think of history as a process without a subject in the relationship to Francis Lieber, would to think of him as a bearer or a symptom or a support of a situated political relation. A relation that is a structural cause that produces the effect we name Lieber, and which in the three previous models has been submerged in favor of some secondary effect to stand in as the motor of international legal history. If humans such as Lieber enter history, they only do so as subjects. And the question is not the meaning or identity of these subjects, their production, their myriad struggles after the fact, but rather the structures that produce their subjecthood, according to what logic, of which they are initiated into and made present in our memory. The question of historical research, then, is how and according to what factors do we come to identify them in their particular form that they take for the purpose of historical narrative. Now, yeah. So this paper moves through another section which I won't subject you to. And what it thinks about is that it takes a step back and thinks, well, there's not only actors or subjects that are, there's this, not only is there a romanticization of the subject, but there's a romanticization of the motor of history that's supposed to drive that subject and how that works, whether it's individual interests, etc., or power relations. And it does a similar sort of analysis through that. I'm going to just skip over that and just go right to a very brief conclusion to lay out this idea. So, the motivation within a structuralist jurisprudence would differ from the false ideology and subjectivist model to international law without falling into a conservative or necessarily sort of Marxist type of tradition. The central argument of this paper is that the critique leveled at Marxism or that it's essentialist, for example, is equally levied at competing liberal models of doing history, even in their most progressive, attuned, empirical, anthropological form. The turn to an explanation of historical movement in terms of culture of the individual and embedding these descriptions in an almost irreducible array of disparate forces that end up in something like their following interests. does not actually explain how these terms as formal units of descriptions themselves developed. In other words, though the content of the individual or culture is thought to be radically contingent, the very legal form itself as a descriptive terminology that makes up a category of study is to date under-theorized and results in overly essentialist or naturalized analysis of international legal history. So we might think of Lieber as himself a symptom of a system which itself is determined through a complex of exchange of institutional apparatuses wrapped up in conditions of production, of materiality, of distribution, and the resulting political struggles that would engender. And though there is no escape from ideology, it's always with us in any system that we have, it's the way a system even creates us as subjects. It's necessary to becoming a subject. The idea would be to start taking seriously how that operation of a system in creating us as a subject works in a very institutional way. So the very form of an idea is what we start looking at, rather than just the content of the idea afterwards. So thank you very much. Yeah.